Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Ulysses Simpson Grant looms large as one of the giants in American history. His journey from West Point cadet to his resignation under a cloud from the Army to becoming Lieutenant General in command of all the armies of the United States during the Civil War, and finally, a two-term president of the country. It's the stuff of legend. His final years marked by being swindled of a fortune he had built and then raising money to support his family as cancer consumed him only added to his heroism and reputation. That reputation, however, shifted over time. He was arguably at the pinnacle of American adoration at his death in 1885, when the nation mourned his passing and remembered his accomplishments. A century later, in the late 20th century, detractors focused on his struggle with alcohol, called him a butcher, and showcased the scandals of his presidential administration. In recent decades, his reputation is now shifting back to a more favorable rating. Those who met him on the rise to fame came away with impressions colored by their knowledge of the household name he had become. I want to share some impressions from three individuals, all patriots, all loyal to the Union cause. Spoiler alert, Grant always seems to be busy working or making things happen as efficiently and rapidly as possible, no matter how large or how small. The first person we're going to hear from is John Hill Brinton, a physician and surgeon who served on the staffs of several prominent generals, including Grant and the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army, William Alexander Hammond. Brinton described his first meeting with Grant in 1891 in his personal memoirs, and it's titled Personal Memoirs of John H. Brinton, Major and Surgeon, U.S. Volunteers, 1861 to 1865. So let's hear that reading from Brinton's memoirs. It goes like this. Of the many who have written of him, Grant, made speeches about him, applauded him, and flattered him, few, very few, are left who saw him and watched him and studied him, as I did. From the very first, he attracted me, and I felt very soon, and indeed at the time of the Battle of Belmont, Missouri, wrote home that the man had come who would finish this war should he have the chance. I first saw General Grant at the dinner table when I was introduced to him by Dr. Simons, receiving from him, Grant, a friendly nod. On the same evening, I went into the bank. Behind the counter, the general and his assistant adjutant general, John A. Rawlins, or Captain Rawlins as he was then, were seated at a little round table. I fancy that I wanted to write a letter home, for I remember that the general very kindly asked me to sit down and continued his work with Rawlins. I had then a good company to observe him, and I did so very closely. He was then a very different looking man from the General Grant or the president of after days. As I first saw him, he was very short, small, a rather spare man with a full beard and mustache. His beard was a little long, very much longer than he afterwards wore it, unkempt and irregular, and of a sandy, tawny shade. His hair matched his beard, and at a first glance, he seemed to be a very ordinary sort of a man, indeed, one below the average in most respects. But as I sat and watched him then, and many an hour afterwards, I found that his face grew upon me. His eyes were gentle, with a kind expression, and thoughtful. He did not, as a rule, speak a great deal. At that time, he seemed to be turning matters over in his mind, and to be very much occupied indeed with the work of the hour. He did nothing carelessly, but worked slowly, every now and then stopping and taking his pipe out of his mouth. But this reminds me that I have not yet spoken of his pipe. The man in after days became so thoroughly identified with the cigar that people could scarcely believe that he was once an assiduous pipe smoker. Well, the pipe which he first used was a meerschaum with a curved stem 8 or 10 inches long, which allowed the pipe to hang down. He smoked steadily and slowly and evidently enjoyed his tobacco. So that's Brinton's recollection. The second comes from Horace Porter, who was one of Grant's most trusted aides during the war and a Medal of Honor recipient who followed Grant to the White House as his personal secretary. Porter described his encounter with Grant in his 1897 memoir, Campaigning with Grant. So let's give it a read. Porter begins, while sitting in my quarters in the little town of Chattanooga, Tennessee, about an hour after nightfall on Friday, October 23rd, 1863, an orderly brought me a message from General George H. Thomas, commander of the Army of the Cumberland, on whose staff I was serving, summoning me to headquarters. A storm had been raging for 2 days, and a chilling rain was falling. A few minutes' walk brought me to the plain wooden one-story dwelling occupied by the commander, which was situated on Walnut Street near 4th, and upon my arrival, I found him in the front room on the left side of the hall with 3 members of his staff and several strange officers. In an armchair facing the fireplace was seated a general officer, slight in figure and of medium stature, whose face bore an expression of weariness. He was carelessly dressed, and his uniform coat was unbuttoned and thrown back from his chest. He held a lighted cigar in his mouth and sat in a stooping posture with his head bent slightly forward. His clothes were wet, and his trousers and top boots were spattered with mud. General Thomas approached this officer and, turning to me and mentioning him by name, said, "I want to present to you General Grant." Thereupon, the officer seated in the chair, without changing his position, glanced up, extended his arm to its full length, shook hands, and said, in a low voice and speaking slowly, "How do you do?" This was my first meeting with the man with whom I was destined afterward to spend so many of the most interesting years of my life. So that's Horace Porter and his recollection. One more I want to share with you. This is a meeting described by Annie Turner Whitten Meyer, a progressive in various women's causes in the 19th century and active in supporting soldiers during the war years as an executive with major aid societies. Her 1895 autobiography, Under the Guns, includes an anecdote about her first visit with General Grant. She writes, "A large army had been thrown in and about Cairo, Illinois, and General Samuel R. Curtis of Iowa gave me a letter and a pass to go down and visit the hospitals there. General Grant in command with headquarters in Cairo. Fortunately for me, I had friends at that point. The great hospitals were at Mound City, 6 miles above. I missed the boat that plied between the two places at irregular hours, and my friends proposed that we call upon General Grant. We found the modest, quiet, uncrowned hero busy at his desk with his staff and orderlies about him. I was painfully conscious that I had no business of sufficient importance to warrant such an intrusion upon the man who stood between us and the army threatening that city that hour. I had not thought of that before coming, but I felt very grateful to my friend who came at once to my aid by explaining that I had come down from St. Louis to visit the hospitals and was the bearer of a pass and letter from General Curtis, and that I also had a pass from General Fremont and had merely called to pay my respects. Well, we fell at once into pleasant conversation, and I found that the general was personally acquainted with friends and relatives of my own. "I will send you up to Mound City," he said. "Oh, don't trouble yourself. I can go up tomorrow," I urged. But he was writing an order and soon dispatched an orderly with it to Captain Somebody. Immediately, my pride took alarm. What if you should send me to Mountain City on one of those screaming, whistling little tugboats? Have you met my medical director? He asked. No, I have not met him, I was forced to answer. I will send him up with you. And an orderly was dispatched to command his presence. Directly, the boat was reported as ready, and the general himself accompanied me to the boat, the city of Memphis, the largest and finest steamer on the Mississippi River. The general simply said, "Take this lady to Mound City and remain till she is ready to return." So there you have first-person accounts of initial meetings and impressions with General Grant, as he's pictured here, about 1863, in this wonderful portrait in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.